April Holt never imagined that dancing in her bedroom would make her famous. The 24-year-old woman from Austin, Texas had started making short videos on TikTok just 3 years ago when she was bored and lonely. Back then, she was working at a coffee shop downtown and struggling to pay rent on her tiny apartment. She would come home tired from work and film herself doing simple dance moves or talking about her day. At first, only her friends watched her videos. She had maybe 50 followers who would leave nice comments about her bright smile and funny jokes. April loved the attention. She had always been shy in school and never thought she was special, but something about the camera made her feel confident and happy. Then one of her videos went viral. It was nothing fancy, just April dancing to a popular song while getting ready for work. She wore her coffee shop uniform and made funny faces in the mirror. Within a week, the video had 5 million views. Suddenly, thousands of people were following her account and asking for more content. April quit her job at the coffee shop within 2 months. Brand companies started reaching out to her, wanting her to promote their makeup and clothes. She could not believe that people would pay her just to show their products in her videos. The money was more than she had ever made before. She moved into a fancy apartment in a tall building downtown Austin. The rent was 3 times what she used to pay, but she could afford it now. The apartment had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. She had a walk-in closet filled with designer clothes that companies sent her for free. Her bathroom was bigger than her old bedroom. Every morning, April would wake up and plan her content for the day. She had to post at least 3 videos to keep her followers happy. She would do makeup tutorials, show her outfits, or just talk about whatever was on her mind. Her followers loved hearing about her life. They felt like they knew her personally. April had 1.2 million followers now. Each video got hundreds of thousands of views within hours. The comments section was always full of people saying how much they loved her and wanted to be her friend. But not all the comments were nice. Some people wrote mean things about how she looked or called her stupid. April tried not to read those comments, but sometimes they hurt her feelings. Her mother, Carol Holt, worried about her daughter constantly. Carol was 62 years old and had worked as a school teacher for 30 years before retiring. She did not understand social media or why strangers cared so much about April's life. Carol lived in a small house about an hour away from Austin and visited April once a week. During these visits, Carol noticed how tired April always looked. Her daughter was constantly checking her phone, responding to messages, and planning new videos. April never seemed to relax anymore. She was always worried about keeping her followers entertained. Carol would ask April if she was happy, and April would always say yes. But Carol could see the stress in her daughter's eyes. April had lost weight and seemed nervous all the time. She jumped whenever her phone buzzed with a notification. The pressure got worse when April started dating Brandon Walsh 6 months ago. Brandon was a 26-year-old musician who had moved to Austin from California. He played guitar and sang in local bars, hoping to get discovered. He was tall and handsome with dark hair and green eyes. April thought he was the most attractive man she had ever met. They met at a coffee shop where Brandon was playing an acoustic set. April was there with her camera, filming herself trying different drinks for a sponsored video. Brandon came over during his break and complimented her smile. They exchanged phone numbers and went on their first date 3 days later. At first, the relationship seemed perfect. Brandon was charming and told April she was the most beautiful woman in Texas. He would write songs about her and play them on his guitar. April's followers loved seeing her with a boyfriend, and she started including Brandon in some of her videos. But after a few months, things began to change. Brandon started making comments about April's work. He would roll his eyes when she filmed videos and call her content shallow. He said real artists like him created meaningful work, while she just danced around for attention. Brandon was also struggling financially. His music was not making money, and he worked part-time at a restaurant to pay his bills. He lived in a small apartment with 2 roommates and drove an old car that broke down frequently. He began asking April for money, saying it was just temporary until his music career took off. April felt bad for Brandon and wanted to help him. She started paying for their dates and bought him new clothes. When his car needed repairs, she gave him $500. When he said he needed a new guitar to record his music, she bought him one that cost $800, but Brandon always wanted more. He suggested that April should use her influence to promote his music. He wanted her to post videos of his songs and tell her followers to follow his social media accounts. When April tried to help, her followers were not interested in Brandon's music. This made him angry and jealous. Brandon started complaining that April cared more about her followers than about him. He would get upset when she spent time filming videos instead of hanging out with him. He accused her of flirting with other men in the comments section of her posts. April began to feel trapped. She loved Brandon and wanted their relationship to work, but his constant demands and criticism were wearing her down. She was also dealing with increased pressure from her followers and sponsors. Everyone expected her to be perfect and happy all the time. 3 weeks before she died, April told her mother during one of their weekly visits that she was thinking about taking a break from social media. Carol was surprised because April had never mentioned wanting to quit before. April explained that she felt overwhelmed and needed time to figure out what she really wanted in life. Carol encouraged her daughter to take a break if that would make her happy. But April seemed torn about the decision. She worried about disappointing her followers and losing the income that supported her lifestyle. She also mentioned that Brandon needed her financial help now more than ever. During their last phone conversation, April sounded different to Carol. Her voice was quiet and sad. She told her mother that she had been receiving strange messages from someone who seemed to know too much about her daily routine. The messages were not threatening exactly, but they made her feel uncomfortable and scared. April also mentioned that Brandon had been pressuring her to give him $5,000 to help pay off some debts. She said she was not sure if she should help him anymore because she was starting to question whether he really loved her or just wanted her money. Carol told her daughter to trust her instincts and not to give Brandon any more money if she felt uncomfortable about it. She offered to come visit April that week, but April said she would be fine and promised to call if she needed anything. That was the last time Carol spoke to her daughter alive. Thursday evening started like any other day for Kelly Martinez. The 23-year-old college student was finishing her shift at the local bookstore where she worked part-time. Kelly had been April Holt's roommate for 8 months, ever since. April moved into the expensive downtown apartment. The two women got along well, and Kelly appreciated that April helped her with rent in exchange for having someone trustworthy to share the space. Kelly had classes until 5 in the evening, then worked at the bookstore until 9. She usually got home around 9:30, and April would often be filming videos in her bedroom or editing content on her laptop in the living room. They would chat about their days and sometimes watch movies together before bed. But when Kelly used her key to unlock the apartment door that Thursday night, something felt wrong immediately. The door was unlocked, which was very unusual. April was always careful about security because she had expensive camera equipment and designer clothes that sponsors had sent her. She never left the door unlocked, even when she was home. The apartment was completely quiet. Usually, Kelly could hear music playing from April's room or the sound of her talking to her camera. The silence made Kelly nervous as she called out April's name. There was no answer. Kelly walked through the living room and noticed that April's laptop was closed on the coffee table. Her ring light and camera were still set up in the corner where she usually filmed, but everything looked untouched. April's purse was on the kitchen counter next to her car keys, which meant she had to be somewhere in the apartment. Kelly checked April's bedroom first. The bed was unmade, and clothes were scattered on the floor, but April was not there. The bathroom door was closed, which was strange because April usually kept it open. Kelly knocked on the door and called April's name again. Still no response. When Kelly opened the bathroom door, she screamed. April was lying in the bathtub, completely still. Her eyes were closed and her skin looked pale and cold. Empty prescription. Bottles were scattered around the tub, and there was a wine bottle on the floor that was half empty. Kelly immediately called 911 on her cell phone. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely dial the numbers. When the operator answered, Kelly could barely speak through her tears. She managed to give the address and explained that her roommate was not breathing. The paramedics arrived within 7 minutes, followed closely by police officers. Kelly waited in the hallway, crying and calling April's mother, Carol. The phone rang several times before Carol answered. When Kelly told her what happened, Carol screamed so loudly that other people in the apartment building came out to see what was wrong. Detective James Rodriguez was the first investigator to arrive at the scene. He was a 45-year-old man who had been working homicide cases for 15 years. Rodriguez had seen many suicides, and this scene looked familiar to him. Young people, especially those under a lot of pressure, sometimes made these tragic decisions. Rodriguez examined the bathroom carefully. April was wearing her pajamas and appeared to have been dead for several hours. The empty prescription bottles contained anxiety medication, and the labels showed they had been filled recently. There was also a handwritten note on the bathroom counter. The note was written on April's personal stationery in her handwriting. It was addressed to her mother and said she was sorry for the pain she was causing. The note mentioned feeling like a failure and not being able to handle the pressure anymore. It asked Carol to take care of Brandon and said April hoped people would remember her happily. Detective Rodriguez photographed everything and collected the prescription bottles as evidence. The wine bottle would be tested for fingerprints, and the note would be analyzed by handwriting experts, but based on his experience, everything pointed to suicide. Kelly was questioned about April's recent behavior. She told the detective that April had seemed stressed lately and was having problems with her boyfriend Brandon. Kelly mentioned that April had been quiet the past few days and spent more time in her room than usual. When asked about Brandon Walsh, Kelly said she did not like him very much. She thought he was using April for her money and success. Kelly had overheard several arguments between them, usually about money or April's work. Brandon often criticized April's videos and made her feel bad about herself. Detective Rodriguez asked Kelly if she knew where Brandon was that evening. Kelly said she had not seen him for a few days, which was unusual because he normally came over at least 3 times a week. She gave the detective Brandon's phone number and address. The detective called Brandon around 11:30 that night. Brandon sounded shocked when he heard the news and said he could not believe April was dead. He claimed he had been at band practice all evening with his 3 bandmates. Rodriguez took down their names and phone numbers to verify the alibi. Brandon asked if he could come to the apartment, but Rodriguez told him the scene was still being processed. Brandon became emotional on the phone and said he loved April and wanted to marry her someday. He asked what happened, and Rodriguez explained it appeared to be suicide. The medical examiner arrived around midnight to examine April's body. Dr. Patricia Williams had been doing this job for 20 years and was very thorough in her work. She estimated that April had been dead for approximately 4 to 6 hours, based on the condition of her body. Dr. Williams noted that April's blood alcohol level would need to be tested, but the smell of wine was strong. The combination of alcohol and anxiety medication could easily cause respiratory failure and death. There were no obvious signs of violence or struggle. The prescription bottles were sent to the lab for testing. The labels showed the medication had been prescribed to April by Dr. Michael Chen, a psychiatrist downtown. Rodriguez made a note to contact Dr. Chen the next day to ask about April's mental state. Carol Holt arrived at the apartment building around 1 in the morning. She had driven from her house as fast as she could, crying the entire way. Police officers would not let her into the apartment, but Detective Rodriguez came down to speak with her in the lobby. Carol was hysterical and kept saying that April would never kill herself. She insisted her daughter was planning a vacation to Hawaii the next week and had just signed a big contract with a makeup company. Carol said April was excited about the future and had never mentioned wanting to hurt herself. Rodriguez tried to comfort Carol and explained that sometimes people hide their depression very well. He told her about the suicide note and the prescription medication, but Carol shook her head and said something was very wrong about the whole situation. Kelly stayed with Carol that night because the older woman was too upset to drive home. They sat in the hotel lobby until morning, with Carol crying and asking the same questions over and over again. Why would April do this? What had she missed as a mother? How could she not have seen the signs? By Friday morning, the news of April's death was spreading on social media. Her followers were posting memorial messages and sharing their favorite videos of her. The hashtag Remember April was trending on TikTok and Twitter. Many people were shocked because April had seemed so happy and successful in her recent posts. The Asab local news picked up the story and reported it as another tragedy involving young social media influencers. They mentioned the pressure that comes with internet fame and how many young people struggle with mental health issues. The story fit a pattern that reporters had covered before. Detective Rodriguez completed his initial investigation within 48 hours. Based on the evidence, April's handwritten suicide note, and the lack of signs pointing to foul play, he recommended that the case be closed as suicide. The medical examiner's report supported this conclusion, but Carol Holt refused to accept this answer. She knew her daughter better than anyone, and nothing about this situation made sense to her. April had too much to live for, and too many plans for the future. Carol was determined to find out what really happened in that apartment on Thursday night. Carol Holt could not sleep for 3 days after her daughter's funeral. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw April's face and heard her voice from their last phone conversation. Something was very wrong about the whole situation, and Carol knew she had to do something about it. The police had closed April's case as suicide, but Carol refused to accept their decision. She had raised April for 24 years and knew her daughter better than anyone else. April was not the type of person to give up on life. She was a fighter who had worked hard to build her successful career. Carol decided to hire a private investigator. She had never done anything like this before, but she was determined to find the truth. After searching online and asking for recommendations, she found Emma Thompson, a former FBI agent who now worked as a private detective in Austin. Emma Thompson was 52 years old and had spent 25 years working for the federal government. She specialized in cases involving suspicious deaths and had helped several families prove that their loved ones had been murdered when police ruled the deaths as suicides. Emma was expensive, but Carol was willing to spend her life savings to get answers. When Carol met Emma at her office, she brought boxes of April's belongings and copies of all the police reports. Emma listened carefully as Carol explained why she believed her daughter had been murdered. The older woman's instincts impressed Emma, who had learned to trust family members who insisted something was wrong. Emma began her investigation by reviewing the police reports and crime scene photos. She immediately noticed several things that Detective Rodriguez had overlooked or dismissed as unimportant. The first red flag was the prescription medication found at the scene. Emma called every pharmacy in Austin to check April's prescription history. What she discovered was shocking. April had never been prescribed anxiety medication before in her life. The bottles found in her bathroom contained pills that were purchased with cash at 3 different pharmacies across the city, all on the same day April died. This was very suspicious because people who plan suicide usually use medication they already have at home. Why would April drive to 3 different pharmacies to buy pills with cash when she could have gotten a prescription from her regular doctor? Emma knew that someone else must have bought those pills. Emma then looked at security footage from the pharmacies. 2 of the stores had cameras that recorded everyone who came in. At the 3rd pharmacy, Emma saw a man who looked like Brandon Walsh buying prescription pills. He was wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, but Emma could tell it was him from his height and the way he walked. The next thing Emma investigated was April's electronic devices. The police report mentioned that April's laptop and phone had been wiped clean of data just hours before she died. This was extremely suspicious because April was very careful about backing up all her work and business files. Emma hired a computer expert named David Lee to try to recover the deleted information. David was able to find some files that had not been completely erased. What he discovered made Emma's blood run cold. April's internet search history showed that she had been researching how to get help for domestic violence victims just 2 days before she died. Emma also found deleted text messages between April and her friend Jessica from California. In these messages, April complained that Brandon was becoming more controlling and aggressive. April wrote that she was scared of Brandon and thinking about breaking up with him, but she was worried about how he would react. The most important evidence Emma found was related to Brandon's alibi. He claimed he had been at band practice with his friends from 6 until 11 on the night April died. But Emma discovered that the practice session had ended at 8, not 11. She found this out by talking to the owner of the studio where the band practiced. Emma then looked at security cameras near April's apartment building. The building itself did not have cameras, but a traffic light 1 block away did. The footage showed Brandon's car driving toward April's building at 6:15 p.m. on Thursday evening. More importantly, it showed the same car leaving the area at 11:47 p.m. This meant Brandon had lied about his whereabouts during the time April died. If he was really innocent, why would he need to lie? Emma knew she was getting close to the truth, but she needed more evidence before going to the police. Emma discovered that Brandon Walsh had serious financial problems. He owed money to several people, including a gambling debt of $8,000 to a dangerous man named Tony Ricci. Tony was known around Austin as someone who hurt people who did not pay him back on time. Emma learned that Brandon had been borrowing money from April regularly for the past 3 months. April's bank records showed she had given him over $15,000 during this time. But the week before she died, April had refused to give Brandon another $5,000 he needed to pay Tony. Emma interviewed April's friends and learned more disturbing information about Brandon's behavior. Her friend Kelly mentioned that Brandon had become increasingly jealous of April's success and angry about her male followers on social media. Another friend said Brandon had once grabbed April's wrist so hard during an argument that it left bruises. The most shocking discovery came when Emma contacted Brandon's ex-girlfriend from California. Lisa Chen agreed to meet with Emma and revealed that Brandon had a history of violence against women. Lisa had dated Brandon for 6 months before April, and he had become abusive when she started making more money than him at her job. Lisa showed Emma photos of bruises Brandon had given her, and a restraining order she had filed against him. Lisa said Brandon had threatened to kill her if she ever told anyone about their relationship. She had been too scared to come forward when she heard about April's death, but Emma convinced her to tell the truth. Emma also discovered that Brandon had been sending April threatening messages from fake social media accounts. He created several fake profiles and pretended to be obsessed fans who knew too much about April's daily routine. This was his way of making April feel scared and dependent on him for protection. After 3 months of investigation, Emma had collected enough evidence to prove that Brandon Walsh had murdered April Holt and made it look like suicide. She organized all her findings into a detailed report and presented it to Carol. Carol cried when she read Emma's report, but she also felt relieved. Her maternal instincts had been right all along. Now she had proof that her daughter had been murdered, and she was determined to make sure Brandon paid for his crime. Emma and Carol took all their evidence to the district attorney's office and demanded that April's case be reopened. At first, the DA was reluctant because the case had already been closed and a lot of time had passed. But when Emma presented her evidence, including the pharmacy footage and the fake alibis, the DA agreed to take another look. District Attorney Patricia Williams assigned Detective Maria Santos to reopen the investigation into April Holt's death. This time, the police would treat the case as a potential homicide instead of accepting it as suicide. Emma's hard work had given April a chance for justice, and Carol finally had hope that her daughter's killer would be caught. Detective Maria Santos had been working homicide cases for 12 years, but she had never seen a case quite like April Holt's. When District Attorney Patricia Williams assigned her to reopen the investigation, Maria knew she was dealing with more than just a simple suicide. The evidence that private investigator Emma Thompson had collected was too compelling to ignore. Maria started her investigation by interviewing Brandon Walsh again. This time, she was not treating him as a grieving boyfriend but as a potential murder suspect. When Brandon arrived at the police station, he seemed nervous and kept asking why they needed to talk to him again. Maria confronted Brandon with the security footage that showed his car near April's apartment on the night she died. At first, Brandon denied being there and stuck to his original story about band practice. But when Maria showed him the actual footage, his face went pale and he became quiet. After several minutes of silence, Brandon changed his story. He admitted that he had gone to April's apartment that evening, but claimed he was only there for a few minutes. He said April was upset and crying, so he tried to comfort her. Brandon insisted that April was already planning to kill herself when he arrived, and he left because he could not talk her out of it. Maria knew Brandon was lying, but she needed more evidence to prove it. She sent the prescription bottles found at April's apartment for more detailed testing. The lab results showed Brandon's fingerprints on 2 of the bottles, which contradicted his claim that he had never touched them. Even more damning was what the lab found on the suicide note. While the handwriting was definitely April's, the paper contained traces of Brandon's saliva. This suggested that Brandon had been very close to April, possibly threatening her, while she wrote the note. Maria also had the medical examiner take another look at April's body. Dr. Patricia Williams conducted a more thorough examination and found evidence that had been missed during the first autopsy. There were small bruises on April's wrists that were consistent with being restrained, and a small cut inside her mouth that suggested she had been forced to swallow something. The new autopsy results supported Maria's theory that April had been murdered. The bruises and cut proved that April had been held against her will and forced to take the pills that killed her. This was not a voluntary suicide, but a carefully planned murder disguised to look like one. Maria continued investigating Brandon's background and discovered more disturbing information. She found that Brandon had been arrested for assault 3 years ago in California, but the charges were dropped when the victim refused to testify. The victim was his ex-girlfriend at the time, who later moved away from California to escape him. Maria also learned that Brandon owed money to several dangerous people in Austin. His gambling debts had reached $20,000, and he was being threatened by loan sharks who wanted their money back immediately. April's death would solve Brandon's financial problems because he expected to inherit her money and belongings. The detective discovered that Brandon had been researching different ways to kill someone and make it look like suicide. His internet search history showed visits to websites about drug overdoses and how long different medications take to work. He had also looked up information about how police investigate suspicious deaths. Maria found more evidence of Brandon's controlling behavior toward April. She interviewed April's friends and learned that Brandon had been isolating April from the people who cared about her. He convinced April that her friends were jealous of her success and did not really care about her. One friend, Jessica Martinez, told Maria that April had called her 2 weeks before she died. April was crying and said that Brandon had pushed her during an argument about money. April admitted she was scared of Brandon but felt trapped because he knew so many personal details about her life that could ruin her career. Maria also discovered that Brandon had been stealing money from April's business accounts. He had access to her computer passwords and had been transferring small amounts of money to his own bank account over several months. April had noticed some of the missing money, but Brandon convinced her it was just accounting errors. The most shocking evidence came when Maria investigated the fake social media accounts that had been sending April threatening messages. Computer experts traced the accounts back to Brandon's internet connection and devices. He had created at least 6 different fake profiles to harass and frighten April. The messages from these fake accounts became increasingly threatening in the days before April's death. They contained specific details about April's daily routine and mentioned things that only someone very close to her would know. Brandon was using these fake accounts to make April feel paranoid and unsafe. Maria learned that Brandon had a detailed plan for murdering April and making it look like suicide. He had been preparing for weeks, buying the prescription drugs with cash and creating the fake threatening accounts to establish a motive for April's supposed suicide. On the night of the murder, Brandon had used April's fear of the fake stalkers to convince her to let him into her apartment. Once inside, he forced her to drink wine and then held her down while he made her swallow the prescription pills. When April tried to fight back, Brandon restrained her, which explained the bruises on her wrists. Brandon then forced April to write the suicide note while she was still conscious but becoming weak from the drugs. He dictated what she should write and threatened to hurt her more if she did not cooperate. This explained why the note contained Brandon's saliva and why some of the phrases did not sound like April's normal way of speaking. After April lost consciousness and died, Brandon cleaned up any evidence that might point to him. He wiped down surfaces where his fingerprints might be found and deleted information from April's phone and computer. that could reveal their recent arguments about money. Brandon's biggest mistake was not realizing that modern technology would eventually expose his lies. The security cameras, cell phone records, and digital forensics all created a trail that led directly back to him. Maria also discovered that Brandon had tried to establish an alibi by asking his bandmates to lie for him. He told them he had been with another woman that night and did not want April to find out. His friends agreed to cover for him, not knowing they were helping him hide a murder. When Maria confronted Brandon's bandmates with the evidence, they quickly admitted the truth. They were horrified to learn that they had been helping a killer and agreed to testify against Brandon in court. The final piece of evidence came from Brandon's cell phone records. Despite his claims that he had not communicated with April on the night she died, phone records showed several calls and text messages between them. The messages showed April becoming increasingly frightened and Brandon becoming more aggressive and threatening. Maria now had enough evidence to arrest Brandon Walsh for the murder of April Holt. She had proven that he had the motive, means, and opportunity to kill April. More importantly, she had evidence that showed exactly how he had planned and carried out the murder. The case that had originally been dismissed as suicide was now clearly revealed as a premeditated murder. Brandon Walsh had killed the woman who loved and supported him, all because of his greed, jealousy, and need to control her. Maria was ready to make sure he faced justice for his crime. Detective Maria Santos knew she had strong evidence against Brandon Walsh, but she needed to build a case that would convince a jury beyond any reasonable doubt. She worked closely with Assistant District Attorney Michael Foster to make sure every piece of evidence was properly documented and legally admissible in court. The first step was to formally arrest Brandon Walsh. On a Tuesday morning, 6 months after April's death, Maria and 3 other officers went to Brandon's apartment with an arrest warrant. Brandon was still in bed when they knocked on his door. When he saw the police officers, his face went completely white. Maria read Brandon his rights and told him he was being arrested for the murder of April Holt. Brandon started crying and saying it was all a mistake. He kept repeating that he loved April and would never hurt her. But Maria had heard these denials from many killers before and she did not believe him. At the police station, Brandon asked for a lawyer immediately. This meant Maria could not question him anymore without his attorney present. But she did not need his confession because the physical evidence was strong enough to prove his guilt. The district attorney's office decided to charge Brandon with first-degree murder. This meant they believed he had planned April's death in advance, which carried the possibility of life in prison without parole. They also charged him with tampering with evidence for cleaning up the crime scene and lying to police. Michael Foster knew this would be a difficult case to prosecute because it had originally been ruled a suicide. The defense would argue that the police had made the right decision the first time and that all the new evidence was just coincidence. Foster needed to present the evidence in a way that showed clearly how Brandon had planned and carried out the murder. The prosecution team spent months preparing for trial. They interviewed dozens of witnesses, including April's friends, family members, and Brandon's ex-girlfriends. Each interview revealed more details about Brandon's pattern of controlling and abusive behavior toward women. Lisa Chen, Brandon's ex-girlfriend from California, agreed to testify about how Brandon had abused her. She was scared to face him in court, but she wanted to help get justice for April. Lisa's testimony would show the jury that Brandon had a history of violence against women who were more successful than him. The prosecution also worked with computer experts to recover more deleted files from April's devices. They found emails where April had been researching lawyers who specialized in domestic violence cases. This showed that April had been planning to leave Brandon and possibly file charges against him for his abusive behavior. Medical experts were prepared to explain how the bruises and injuries on April's body proved she had been murdered. Dr. Patricia Williams would testify that the pattern of injuries was not consistent with suicide, but with someone being held down and forced to swallow pills against their will. The prosecution team also prepared to present evidence about Brandon's financial problems and gambling debts. They would show that Brandon needed money desperately, and that April's death would solve his financial troubles. This gave Brandon a clear motive for murder. Meanwhile, Brandon's defense attorney, Robert Johnson, was preparing his own strategy. Johnson was an experienced criminal lawyer who had successfully defended several murder cases. He knew the prosecution, had strong evidence, but he believed he could create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury. Johnson's defense would focus on the fact that the case had originally been ruled a suicide by experienced police officers and medical examiners. He would argue that April really had killed herself, and that all the new evidence was being misinterpreted by investigators who were under pressure to solve the case. The defense planned to present April's death as a tragedy caused by the pressures of social media fame and online harassment. They would argue that April was depressed and overwhelmed by her career, and that she made the tragic decision to end her life. Johnson also planned to attack the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses, especially Lisa Chen and April's friends. He would suggest that they were making up stories about Brandon's abusive behavior because they wanted someone to blame for April's death. As the trial date approached, both sides continued gathering evidence and preparing their arguments. The case had attracted a lot of attention from the media because April had been a popular social media influencer. Many of her followers were demanding justice and closely following the legal proceedings. Carol Holt attended every pre-trial hearing and meeting with the prosecution team. She had spent most of her savings hiring Emma Thompson to investigate the case, but she felt it was worth every penny to get justice for her daughter. Carol was determined to see Brandon convicted for his crimes. The prosecution faced some challenges in preparing their case. Some of April's friends were reluctant to testify because they did not want to be involved in a murder trial. Others were scared of Brandon and worried about their own safety if they spoke against him in court. Maria Santos worked hard to convince reluctant witnesses to testify. She explained that their testimony could help convict April's killer and prevent him from hurting other women in the future. Most of the witnesses eventually agreed to cooperate, understanding that their testimony was crucial for getting justice. The prosecution also had to deal with the defense's attempts to exclude certain evidence from the trial. Brandon's lawyers argued that some of the digital evidence had been obtained illegally and should not be allowed in court. They also tried to prevent Lisa Chen from testifying about Brandon's past abuse, claiming it was not relevant to April's case. Judge William Thompson would make the final decisions about what evidence could be presented to the jury. Thompson was known as a fair judge who followed the law carefully. He allowed most of the prosecution's evidence to be admitted, ruling that it was relevant to proving Brandon's motive and pattern of behavior. The jury selection process took 3 days. Both sides questioned potential jurors carefully to make sure they could be fair and impartial. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 25 to 68 years old. As the trial was about to begin, Michael Foster felt confident about the prosecution's case. They had physical evidence, digital evidence, witness testimony, and expert analysis that all pointed to Brandon's guilt. But he also knew that defending attorneys could be skilled at creating doubt, and he would need to present the evidence clearly and convincingly. Brandon Walsh sat in the courtroom looking nervous and scared. He had lost weight during the months in jail waiting for trial, and he looked much different than the confident musician who had dated April Holt. His family had hired the best lawyer they could afford, but they were running out of money to pay. For his defense, the case that had started as an apparent suicide was now ready to be presented to a jury as a carefully planned murder. April Holt's family and friends filled the courtroom, hoping that justice would finally be served. The trial would determine whether Brandon Walsh would spend the rest of his life in prison or walk free to potentially hurt other women. Maria Santos reviewed her notes one final time before the trial began. She had worked harder on this case than any other in her career, and she was determined to prove that April Holt had been murdered by the man she trusted and loved. The evidence was strong, but now it was up to the jury to decide Brandon's fate. The trial of Brandon Walsh for the murder of April Holt began on a cold Monday morning in January, exactly 10 months after April's death. The courtroom was packed with reporters, April's family and friends, and curious members of the public who had followed the case in the news. Assistant District Attorney Michael Foster stood up to give his opening statement. He looked directly at the jury and spoke in a clear, strong voice. Foster explained that this was not a case about suicide, but about a man who murdered the woman he claimed to love because of greed, jealousy, and his need to control her. Foster told the jury about April's successful career and her plans for the future. He explained how Brandon had become increasingly angry about April's success and desperate for money to pay his gambling debts. The prosecutor described how Brandon had planned April's murder for weeks, buying drugs with cash and creating fake social media accounts to make it look like she was being stalked. The defense attorney, Robert Johnson, gave a very different opening statement. He told the jury that April Holt had been a troubled young woman who was overwhelmed by the pressures of social media fame. Johnson argued that April had made the tragic decision to end her own life and that the police had been right to rule her death a suicide the first time. Johnson claimed that the new investigation was flawed and that prosecutors were trying to turn a tragedy into a murder case because they were under pressure from April's family and the media. He asked the jury to remember that Brandon Walsh had loved April and was also a victim of this terrible tragedy. The prosecution began presenting their case by calling Carol Holt to testify. April's mother was nervous, but determined as she took the witness stand. She told the jury about her daughter's personality and dreams, emphasizing that April was not the type of person to give up on life. Carol explained how she had refused to accept the suicide ruling because she knew her daughter so well. She described hiring private investigator Emma Thompson and the evidence they had discovered. Carol's testimony was emotional but powerful, and several jury members were seen wiping away tears. Detective Maria Santos testified about the physical evidence found at the crime scene. She explained how Brandon's fingerprints were on the prescription bottles and how his saliva was found on the suicide note. Santos also presented the security camera footage that showed Brandon's car near April's apartment on the night she died. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Williams, testified about the bruises and injuries on April's body that proved she had been restrained and forced to swallow the pills. Dr. Williams explained that these injuries were not consistent with suicide, but clearly showed that April had been murdered. Lisa Chen, Brandon's ex-girlfriend from California, gave some of the most damaging testimony against him. She described how Brandon had become abusive when she started earning more money than him at her job. Lisa showed the jury photographs of bruises Brandon had given her and explained how he had threatened to kill her if she ever told anyone about his abuse. Johnson cross-examined Lisa aggressively, trying to suggest that she was lying about Brandon's abuse because she wanted revenge against him. But Lisa remained calm and consistent in her testimony, and the jury seemed to believe her story. Several of April's friends testified about Brandon's controlling behavior and his increasing jealousy of April's success. They described arguments they had witnessed and April's growing fear of Brandon in the weeks before her death. One friend testified that April had asked her about lawyers who help domestic violence victims. The prosecution presented evidence about Brandon's financial problems and gambling debts. They showed that Brandon owed $20,000 to dangerous people and that April had recently refused to give him more money. This gave Brandon a clear motive for murder. Computer experts testified about the fake social media accounts Brandon had created to harass and threaten April. They explained how they had traced the accounts back to Brandon's devices and internet connection. The threatening messages became more frequent and scary in the days before April's death. Brandon's bandmates testified that he had asked them to lie about his whereabouts on the night April died. They explained how Brandon had told them he was with another woman and did not want April to find out. The bandmates seemed embarrassed and sorry that they had helped Brandon create a false alibi. The defense presented their case by calling witnesses who testified about April's stress and the pressures she faced as a social media influencer. They brought in a psychiatrist who had never examined April, but claimed that her behavior in the weeks before her death was consistent with someone planning suicide. Johnson also tried to suggest that the police investigation had been sloppy and that the evidence against Brandon was circumstantial. He argued that all the physical evidence could be explained by Brandon's presence at April's apartment earlier that day, when she was still alive. Brandon Walsh did not testify in his own defense. Johnson advised him not to take the witness stand because he was afraid Brandon would say something that would hurt his case even more. This decision surprised many people in the courtroom who expected Brandon to deny the charges against him. The closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon after 2 weeks of testimony. Michael Foster summarized all the evidence against Brandon and asked the jury to use their common sense. He pointed out that Brandon had lied repeatedly about his whereabouts and actions on the night April died. Foster reminded the jury about the physical evidence, including Brandon's fingerprints on the prescription bottles and the bruises on April's body that proved she had been restrained. He emphasized that all this evidence together painted a clear picture of premeditated murder. Robert Johnson made one final attempt to convince the jury that April had committed suicide. He argued that the prosecution had not proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt and that the evidence could be interpreted in different ways. Johnson asked the jury to find Brandon not guilty and to remember him as another victim of this tragedy. Judge William Thompson gave the jury detailed instructions about the law and the different charges Brandon was facing. The jury then left to begin their deliberations on Saturday morning. They had to decide whether Brandon was guilty of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, or not guilty of any crime. The jury deliberated for 8 hours over 2 days. Carol Holt and April's friends waited anxiously in the courthouse hallway, praying that justice would be served. Brandon sat in his cell, probably wondering if he would spend the rest of his life in prison. On Sunday afternoon, the jury announced they had reached a verdict. Everyone packed into the courtroom as the jury foreman stood up to read their decision. The courtroom was completely silent as people waited to hear Brandon's fate. The jury found Brandon Walsh guilty of first-degree murder and tampering with evidence. Several people in the courtroom gasped, and Carol Holt began crying with relief. Brandon showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but his face was very pale. Judge Thompson scheduled Brandon's sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later. Under Texas law, first-degree murder carried a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Brandon would never be free again to hurt another woman. At the sentencing hearing, Carol Holt was allowed to give a victim impact statement. She spoke directly to Brandon about how his actions had destroyed her family and taken away her beloved daughter. Carol said she hoped Brandon would spend every day in prison thinking about what he had done. Judge Thompson sentenced Brandon Walsh to life in prison without parole for the murder of April Holt. He also gave Brandon an additional 10 years for tampering with evidence. Thompson said that Brandon had committed a heinous crime against a young woman who had trusted and loved him. After the trial ended, Carol Holt established the April Holt Foundation to help other families who are fighting to overturn wrongful suicide rulings. She also worked to raise awareness about domestic violence and the warning signs that friends and family should watch for. Detective Maria Santos received recognition for her thorough investigation that brought justice for April. The case became an example of how important it is for police to carefully investigate all suspicious deaths, even when they initially appear to be suicides. The case also led to changes in how police departments handle deaths involving young social media influencers. Officers now receive special training about the unique pressures and dangers that online personalities face, and they are taught to look more carefully for signs of domestic violence. April's followers on social media created lasting memorials to honor her memory. They shared stories about how April's content had made them happy and inspired them to follow their dreams. Many people said April's tragic death had taught them to be more careful about the relationships in their own lives. Brandon Walsh is now serving his life sentence in a maximum security prison in Texas. He will never be eligible for parole and will die in prison for the crime he committed. Several other inmates who knew about his case have made it clear that men who kill women are not welcome in their prison community.